A major book has come out. I mean, when I say major, it costs $75 in the paperback edition. I believe it's 572 pages long, and it's got 42 chapters. Woo! 42 chapters. And the name of the book is Evaluating the Brain Disease Model of Addiction. You know, I could riff for a half hour on the title. Do you personally ever use the term brain disease model of addiction?
No, not unless I'm talking about why it doesn't make sense to have a brain disease model of addiction.
I don't even use it when I'm talking about that. I just use the disease theory.
Right.
And so in the book, I can't remember the initials. They use BDMA as a thing. And I sort of have to look it up. Why don't I use the brain disease model of addiction? How do I differ from the people, the two of the editors? There are four main editors. Nick Heather's a man I go back a long, long way with. And originally our connection had to do with alcohol. Sally Satel is somebody we both know, you know, I've had conversations with. What am I thinking about when I say the disease model of addiction?
That distinguishes you from someone who would be focused only on a brain disease model. Well, I think that there have been attempts to reduce the idiocy of reducing everything to the brain that go slightly beyond it, but still keep on the disease track. Is that your basis for being more general?
To me, AA I mean, obviously the difference between the old disease model, which people draw, is, well, these people have brain scans, what Norovolko.
Right.
But the essential elements in the AA and the brain disease model, they're essentially the same.
Oh, and you're go back to even, you know, AA predating brain scans and people saying this is like a spiritual malady.
They're all saying it's out of control. It's due to
Right.
the substance. I can't influence it.
Right.
It's a disease. They're both part of the disease model, and I can't get it in my brain. I can't do it. That they're saying, oh, this is the brain disease model, not the old AA 12-step disease model. I can't make that distinction. So that's one place. And Nick Heather started out with alcohol. He's a person who's aware of AA and its limitations, but let's not get into that. What do you think about the title, Evaluating the Brain Disease Model of Addiction? How does that title hit you? As opposed to the book behind you, Outgrowing Addiction.
Right. Well, the title centers itself on the brain disease model of addiction. So it sort of suggests, if you don't know any better, that there's this thing that's the brain disease model. We need to take a good look at that. You know, we need to see its value, determine its value here.
They're pussyfooting up to it. And you happen to know, Nick Heather and Sally Satel, are they going to say, oh, you know, there's these good things about the brain disease model and these bad things about it? That's not what the book's about. Why did they do that? Why would they name that, use that title?
So people will pick it up. I mean, because
they're making a mistake. I think they're doing that because, God bless his soul, it's an over academic way of doing things. It's sort of saying, well, I don't do a good British accent, Nick's English. Well, we want to show that we're being objectively evaluating all of those things. And so,
but you don't objectively evaluate, you know, whether Santa is real or whether there are unicorns. And so you're saying this is one of those things that you don't need to be diplomatic or scientifically, you know, you don't have to be so objective here. You can dismiss a dumb idea before.
And it's really a systematic refutation of the disease, the brain disease model. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
ironically, in their effort to be integraful, they're not 1,000% on the board. By the way, how many disease advocates, BDMA advocates, did they get to contribute to the? I think there are 42 chapters. How many did they get of them to contribute?
I'm not aware that any contributed. Did some?
None.
Right.
They were able to reprint articles, like the very original 1997 one by Alan Leshner, Why Addiction is a Brain Disease and Why It Matters. So they picked up a few of those.
So, okay, I see what you're saying. And maybe I have lost track of, you've been sort of saying a few things out here and there. If they're serious about creating an objective scientific evaluation of this thing, then you would think they would seriously, get people who are serious about the brain disease model.
But I'm going to tell you what they say.
Right.
They say they're offended because they wrote letters to these people. And not only did they say no, but a lot of cases they didn't even respond. But when you talk to some of these people, they're pissed off. They had a webinar on the book, and I entered one question. And that question was, how do you interpret the refusal of any BDMA advocates to participate in your volume? And one of the people, just got pissed off again. He said, they didn't even respond to us.
Why would you respond to it? I mean, there's first of all, their pet theory is going to be destroyed. They don't have a leg to stand on, or else it's just already such a sound theory in your mind that why do you even entertain such a thing? Which is what you're saying, Sally.
They're winning. Yeah. It's sort of like, I'm going to use a boxing analogy. There used to be a man named Floyd Patterson, and he was the heavyweight champ of America. And he had some very savvy manager named Customato. And everybody knew the toughest guy around was Sonny Liston. And Customato was not going to let Floyd Patterson box Sonny Liston because Floyd Patterson was the heavyweight champion of the world. And Customato knew, and Floyd Patterson fought Sonny Liston, and Liston knocked him out in 2 minutes of the first round, and they had a rematch. And Sonny Liston knocked Floyd Patterson out in 2 minutes of the first round of the second fight. So what you're saying, in some deeper sense, do they know they're full of shit? Do they know they're going to lose this fight? But they're in charge. Norfolko's head of the NIDA. Why bother with these punks? Nobody cares about them. You're the winner. So I almost am reviewing the title and the participants. It's a one-sided thing. They couldn't get them to participate. And the title, as you were saying, is totally reactive. They're reacting off the brain disease. I mean, evaluating the brain. There are 5 nouns in the title, and 4 of the nouns are theirs. When we write Outgrowing Addiction, that's what we want to talk about. We actually have, and we actually have the disease model. What's the subtitle of the?
With common sense instead of disease therapy.
So that's the subtitle, but we didn't say disease model refuted as the title.
Right. So you don't want a title. You're reading this. You read the title as here's what addiction isn't in 42 chapters. Here's what perhaps addiction isn't, but could be in 42 chapters.
And you're staring at that. That's the title. It's about the brain. They didn't have any PR people here. So I won't call it a dispute. Nick Heather, I love the man. I've known him for 40 years, and nobody has stuck up for me more than Nick Heather. But I pointed out, apropos of where we're going, the book does not focus on an alternative model of addiction. It takes pot shots at the brain disease model. And Nick Heather wrote me back saying, well, Stanton, did you ever think that perhaps, refuting the brain disease model works its way towards presenting a uniform model of addiction? And again, I thought, what an ass backwards way of going about it. If you believe, and Nick believes, more or less what I believe. I wrote Love and Addiction with Archie Bratsky in 1975. I just want to, in one chapter, we present something refuting all the major beliefs about addiction. And then the next chapter is called A General Theory of Addiction. We wrote this in 1975. If addiction is now known not to be primarily a matter of drug chemistry or body chemistry, and if we therefore have to broaden our conception of dependency-creating objects to include a wider range of drugs, then why stop with drugs? Why not look, because addiction was only heroin then in 75. Why not look at the whole range of things, activities, and even people to which we can and do become addicted? We must, in fact, do this if addiction is to be made a viable concept. So you see, my logic is when you start talking about addiction is not to do with drugs, you immediately switch off the brain chemistry model. Because, everybody can say gambling and love and sex affect the brain. Yes, but it's a real stretch to say, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, marijuana, alcohol, love, sex, and food all impact the brain in exactly that. You don't have to be a biologist to say we're obviously talking about something that's hitting people at a different level than specific neurochemicals or brain receptor sites. Talking about a larger gestalt. The very act of approaching addiction as a general concept in and of itself refutes a reductive biological or chemical vision of addiction. So my argument, I think Love and Addiction did more to refute the brain disease model of addiction than 573 pages and 42 chapters at $75 than this collection of work by all these brilliant people. But there's one person in the volume who agrees with me quite a lot. He's the person who's most similar to my outlook, which I think you were aware of, and you interviewed him. Do you know who that person is?
I'm drawing a blank. I'm trying to think of who the co-authors are on that book.
Alexander.
Oh, Bruce, yeah.
Now, Bruce Alexander actually has two individually authored chapters in this volume. And he has the last chapter in the volume. It's sort of like, well, let's cut out the whole damn volume. Let's just read Bruce's chapters.
Yeah.
And do you think Bruce, how does Bruce Alexander differ from Sally Sattel and Nick Heather? But how does he differ from me? The concept I'm looking for is academies. So Bruce's two chapters are, Bruce has an overall, view of how the world economy and society is creating addiction.
Yeah.
The internationalization of addiction. In general, it's a very dense book, The Globalization of Addiction, but it's not something you would read in an academic journal.
Right. He writes in plain speak, and he's not a reductionist. He writes in plain English. You're right. His writing is dense, but only because he's talking about the entire world, and he differs from you in that. So that's like the writing style is similar. Let's just speak to people in plain English here, and he doesn't focus on chemical draws. He doesn't do any of. He talks about how people live in the world. He thinks about things at a societal level and plants his flag there. Whereas you have an emphasis on each person who has an issue needs to be able to feel like they have agency in this world. And I think he has some idea that the world needs to take care of itself so that each individual can be better. And, I believe you share that feeling to an extent, but you can't do that without empowering people.
Well put. I would call his approach a political approach. He's arguing for a political solution, which you and I wouldn't disagree with, but we're not going to make that happen. He's not going to make it happen either. It's good to know that and to look at it, but those trends in society are massive. So that's on the one hand where you and I would say, well, that's important. We wouldn't tackle it at that level. And Bruce is not a clinician. He's a world philosopher on the one hand, and he's an experimental psychologist. Rat Park, his experiment is an experiment. He's an experimental psychologist who worked with animals, of all things. And in his life, he's worked with individuals. He's a psychologist. But we have a clinical approach where we discuss talking to people about issues in a way that reduces their addiction. I can't say for certain. Well, Nick Heather's a clinician. And he's done brief interventions. And Nick Heather believes in treatment in a way that I don't, which is funny because I'm a treatment provider, and as are you, coaching provider. But Nick will say things like, well, there's certain people that have to be, ushered into treatment, even though he did do a big self-help book. I find him I don't find him consistent on that topic. I'm not putting down Nick Heather. As I've said a million times, when I was in the throes of fighting for my academic life, when the attack came out by Mary Pendry et al. On the Sobel's research, Nick Heather published a book with Ian Robertson called Controlled Drinking. They're English, of course. So they weren't in the middle of this life and death struggle in the US. And he just laid out all of the evidence. Nick is an extremely thorough academic person, showing that people do control their drinking. We're not going to go through the whole book. And honestly, at the time, it saved my life because I was sinking, being banned in the United States for imagining that people could moderate their drinking. So, but the book is not at a clinical level, and Bruce doesn't work at Bruce doesn't write at a clinical level. He's not he's an experimental. Rat Park's an experiment, and the globalization is a world political philosophy thing. This is just totally imagining everything. How did they arrive at Bruce Alexander writing 2 individual chapters, including the concluding chapter in the whole volume is replacing the BDMA, for fuck's sake, a paradigm shift in the field of addiction. That's the last chapter in the book. So in a way, Nick is saying, we analyzed the brain disease model, and that's how we hope to present. But Bruce presents the uniform model.
Right, but look at this guy. Right.
I don't know the answer to this. I know some of the key parts. How did that happen? And like I say, that whole globalization and that whole capitalism and being detached, that's not the way I don't think virtually anybody else in the book writes. Mm-hmm. They don't talk about global concepts. And his is the only, so far as I'm aware, well, look, here's a way, this is an addiction model. How did Bruce slot into that? How did he get those 2 chapters what was the deliberation that had them include him doing that?
Well, in the first place, he's the Rat Park guy. I mean, that has to have something to do with it. I mean, he's done the experiment that he's extrapolated from and spoken about philosophically, that when a person feels like they're in a cage, so to speak, or in reality, they're not going to and have no attractive alternatives in their life to whatever's there in front
That's
of them.
how I speak.
Right.
He would say when an organism, a rodent, is deprived of normal rewards, he'll turn to narcotics. I'm the one who sort of said, well, think about it. That's sort of what the story is with human beings. And that's where he goes with the globalization argument. Yeah.
But I think you are right that he writes in a way that shows he's a guy operating in the real world. And maybe they needed that. At least if I'm them, that's how I would leverage Bruce or take advantage of Bruce. So it's like let's do all the dissecting and parsing out here, and I'll give it over to Bruce, who has a real world concept of this.
That's well put. I would say Bruce is academic. Bruce doesn't write popular books. Globalization's not a bestseller. By the way, with all due respect, his Rat Park research, the single thing that is most referred to if you do all the citation indexes, is a chapter in The Meaning of Addiction that I wrote with Bruce, Animal and Infant Addiction. That's the one place where it's put all together in a big picture. But they feel comfortable enough with Bruce as an academician. And as you said it, but they sort of, had a sense that, well, those components, which they themselves don't contribute, a global picture and a new model of addiction, they should be there. And so they handed that off to Bruce. So, I'm a person who, I don't belong to any group. There's a whole other story. This is put together by the members of something called the Addiction Theory Network, a list from which I was removed. And in fact, Nick, the two guys who run the list, are both friends of mine. Nick Heather, and I know him as Steve, but he has another name. I'll think of it in a minute. They're both academicians. Nick's retired. Nick's over 80. He's a professor emeritus, and the other guy's a professor. And they invited me back, and I declined to join. I hope I'm not saying anything out of school. Nick said, well, Stanton, if you might have rejoined, we might have invited you to contribute to the volume. But I'm not a comfortable. Derek Heim is the other list co-owner, and they both invited me back. They're both friends of mine. In many ways, they've been two of the academics who are most encouraging, and they sense a role that I might be connected with, but I'm not an academician, and that Bruce gave them the most comfortable version of. Now, one of the things I held against that Addiction Theory Network, this is an example of where I'm wrong in life. I thought they were ineffectual. They put together this volume, 573 pages and 42 chapters. That's a piece of work. So that's A. They did the volume. And I mentioned there was a podcast where they're marketing the book. That podcast, webinar, they're developing a series. And of all the contributors of the chapters, all the names in there, they're doing in April a webinar by one of the authors to talk about his views on addiction. Would you be able to guess who that person is?
You said his.
It's Bruce Alexander.
It's Bruce, right? Yeah.
And so, I have no inside information about. I mean, I correspond with Bruce from time to time. So I'm thinking, Bruce is just not, he stands out in this volume He's different from virtually everybody else included in the volume. He wasn't present in the webinar promoting the book. The four chief editors were, including Sally and Nick, and the other two spoke also. Bruce wasn't there as far as I was aware. He wasn't on stage, on screen. But the first person they go to now that they're thinking, I think constructively, well, let's present our ideas in a more proactive way. And they say, who should we, have give a webinar? It's Bruce.
So what do you think about that? He's the closest to you, and obviously there's something about him that adds to cohesion. He's not going to tell people to piss off because their ideas are lame or because they're being too technical or anything. He just gives his idea and shoots it straight as he can. And he's a nice guy. He's easy to.
No, Bruce. Bruce is a nice guy. Bruce is a conflict avoiding guy.
Yes.
He doesn't get annoyed, and that's one reason he hasn't been as visible. Bruce doesn't go to venues where people are going to, and people do attack him. There are people that say that Rat Park's not a real experiment. A real experiment is you vary something by 1 iota, you know what I mean? And then you increase the dosage of the morphine. That's an experiment. Putting rats in a cage or putting rats in Rat Park, that's not science to some people. There are people who attack Bruce. And Bruce doesn't go places where they attack him. Bruce isn't a fighting man. And so he gets along with colleagues. He gets along with opponents. Nora Volko is not going to invite Bruce Alexander to present at NIDA. So when I say gets along with opponents, and as far as I'm aware, the most hardcore kind of non-harm reduction entity in the addiction world is the journal Addiction. And they've let Bill Miller in there. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware that Alan Marlett's published in there. I think they did one interview with Nick. He's not a mainstay. Nick is of there. I'm not aware that Bruce has ever appeared in the journal Addiction. I actually have, but not since 1985. When they reviewed the meaning of addiction and where they asked me to write a chapter an article called How Can Addiction Occur with Non-Drug Involvements, which is ironic, all things considered, given my discussion with Nick around that. And so Nick's an obliging, agreeable, Bruce is an obliging, agreeable guy. He hasn't pissed anybody off other than his ideas pissing people off. Mm-hmm. He does. And so, Bruce himself is over 80. And it's hard to say this webinar is going to make him a star. I don't want to overdo it. But it's sort of like, well, in one area, he's coming into his own where he's the most viable representative of a point of view that I feel has to be front and center, and which is subterranean in evaluating the brain disease model of addiction. And for example, his chapter, We Need a New Paradigm, has BDMA in it. The first couple of things I read in the volume, I said, what the hell's BDMA? I couldn't even get it into my head. It's not something like you use around the house or that we talk about. So we're in an let me summarize. To me, it's too focused on BDMA. It views the brain disease model as somehow different from the old AA disease model. To me, they gave up before the fight started. They're sort of saying, well, we're just going to talk about BDMA. Why wouldn't you talk about it? Because sort of everybody believes it, rather than saying, boom, here's what we think addiction is. Mm-hmm. And in that mix, Bruce is a low-key guy, other than a guy having those crazy Rat Park ideas. Personally, he's a very low-key guy. His stock has risen. And so, I look forward to seeing how this all comes out in the wash. As I said, ironically, Nick and Bruce are both over 80 years old. It's sort of maybe they're, getting to the point like, what can they do to me now exactly?
Right, right. Well, a reasonable review, I think, of what's the whole book title again? I know you don't like saying it.
Evaluating the brain disease model of addiction. What do you say? What's my review? What can you give a summary, Chaz, sentence?
That the book falls apart at the title, first of all. But if you can get past it, then what you're going to get is some sort of refutation of a very specific idea of what addiction is. And it's not just the disease model, it's the brain disease model. So it's a scientifically oriented, objective seeming, or it's supposed to be, critique of the brain disease model. And there's sort of talking, the authors, at least in their objectives, seem to be talking in both sides of their mouth. On one hand, they're interested, a la Bruce Alexander, in changing an entire paradigm of the way we think, but no one's being proactive about offering this sort of a model. Instead, they're dissecting a specific model that they disagree with. And if they're going to do that, and if they're going to be so objective, if they want the veneer of scientism, then maybe they should make sure that they can have a collaborative scientific process, because it's not like people on the other end were interested in participating. So, but if the kernels of good are that they did invite someone like Bruce Alexander, someone with a practical vision, and he is the one who they say, well, you should speak. You're the one who has some ideas and about how to move forward. So, there's a...
And I do, all of this may sound very the fact that there's a gigantic volume published by a reputable academic house with a bunch of important academics, although, Sally, they're all viewed, in major point, askew. They're more British in this than normally. There's not a lot of mainstream. Bill Miller isn't in it. Carl Hart's not in it. Alan Marlett's dead, of course. But the fact that God bless Nick and all of them for putting out a solid volume, it's sort of like, boom, here's 573 pages. It says the brain disease model is full of shit.
Yeah.
It's not like somebody, some nut, or some journalist like Johan Hari, or some off-the-wall character like Stanton Peele said this. Boom! Take a look at this volume. $75, Buster.
So if there's some value to this, is that it shows that intelligent people, reputable people, can come together to form a massive document, so that when people refute dumb ideas, you can point to this, and you don't have to be individually, seemingly fringe anymore, which is good. And all those people are brilliant and probably necessary in that battle.
Well, good summary. All right, so we come to the end of another session. Thanks for rescuing me from oblivion and anonymity by getting these little ideas out there in these little kernels, and we'll see you again next week.